What's your most frustrating "I can't believe this has been going on for so long" moment? Obligatory long post ahead. I left my son's father in 2000, took my son and moved into a women's refuge temporarily. I left him because I couldn't deal with his drinking anymore. I found him drinking cheap cider that had never seen an apple in its life at 7:30 a.m. There were other problems, related to his drinking that also contributed to the separation. One of my leaving comments was that he'd drink himself to death. He had regular contact with us but liked to cause problems. I once went to drop my son off at 2 p.m. and my ex was shaking from the delirium tremens. I took my son home and stopped all contact. 9 months later he decided to take me to court for visitation rights. As part of the court proceedings, we had to see a social worker. The social worker spoke to both parents and child secretly to see if a compromise could be achieved. The first social worker, a woman, was nice but became ill after the first meeting and we were assigned a different one, this time a man. I told him that my ex was an alcoholic and couldn't look after himself, let alone small child. I wanted him to prove that he could be sober for 1 year before I agreed to him seeing my son, but the social worker disagreed and supervised visits started once a fortnight. 6 months later, we went back to court, meaning more meetings with the stupid social worker. I again stressed that contact would not take place unsupervised without my ex proving he could be sober for a year. I think it was at this point that the social worker told me I was a bad mother for preventing a father from seeing his son. A single mother couldn't possibly set rules and discipline a boy. That because there was no father figure in my son's life I would fail as a parent. That 7 out of 10 children who grow up without a father end up in prison or on substances. Well, the next week, after doing some research, I countered his arguments with the fact my own father was in a different country when I was growing up and I was neither an ex-prisoner or an addict. That 2 of my friends, brought up without their real dads, had been the same as me, not addicts or criminals. I also had information from Alcoholics Anonymous stating that 90% of kids brought up with an alcoholic parent go on to become alcoholics themselves. I also pointed out that they had several pieces of information incorrect in their paperwork, including my age. They had me down as 10 years older than I am. I showed him my birth certificate but he refused to amend it. He had the spelling for my son's name wrong and refused to amend that, despite seeing his birth certificate. The social worker refused to acknowledge the data I provided because it didn't fit his narrative that I was just a jealous ex-girlfriend. I also demanded that my ex do blood tests to prove he had stopped drinking. I said that his drinking was out of control and he'd drink himself to death. He was court-ordered to have liver function blood test but refused to do it because he was, quote, scared of needles. He agreed to a urine test which showed that he had been drinking. He wasn't scared of needles but fooled the social worker. Supervised visits continued with 6 monthly court reviews, where the social worker and his solicitor would push for unsupervised contact, but I refused to budge until my ex could prove he'd been sober for a year. Same old story. He never could. The social worker refused to believe my ex was an alcoholic. During this time, my ex moved in with what would be his future wife and her husband. They enabled his drinking, whereas I had always refused to enable it. I was eventually persuaded to go to unsupervised contact, but I refused to allow the woman or her husband to be present for it. I told the social worker that they had their children removed by social services and adopted. The social worker of course didn't believe me. On the occasions that my ex would turn out to see my son, he would be drunk. He would not actually spend time with my son. He would leave my son alone with the woman while he would be drinking in the kitchen. I couldn't prove this so the social worker refused to believe me. This was in breach of the court order but it was allowed to happen. Due to his drinking problem, my ex was constantly getting in trouble, so he obviously ended up in prison. I refused point blank to agree to take my son to a prison for visitation and thankfully the judge agreed. We could have a year of peace. While my ex was in prison the woman divorced her then husband and started a relationship with my ex the week before he got out of prison. I saw a small article in the newspaper about a new type of test to prove alcohol use that didn't involve taking a blood test. I immediately made an appointment with my solicitor. He had also seen the same article and agreed to demand it for the next time we went to court. We didn't go back to court until about 8 months after he got out of prison. The same social worker tried convincing me to believe that my ex was no longer drinking and if the new test came back, I would have to agree to more unsupervised visits. This new alcohol testing method involved analyzing a person's hair, trying to get out of it. My ex shaved his head. Thankfully the test could be done from any hair and they plucked them from his armpit and groin. The test came back proving he was drinking the equivalent of a full bottle of whiskey a day. The social worker still tried convincing me that I was a terrible parent for not wanting a father to spend time with his son. About this time, the woman's ex-husband also got out of prison and moved in with her and my ex. I really didn't like them and again repeated that they had their children removed by social services and adopted. The social worker told me I had to allow this woman to be involved, that I was merely a jealous ex upset that he had found someone else and I was still single. During all these years, I was still in college trying to get my degree. I didn't have time for a relationship and was focused on getting my life together so I could be a responsible parent, but the social worker told me I was a bad parent for doing all that. It didn't count because single mothers couldn't possibly juggle it all and my son would end up in prison by 18 and an addict if I didn't agree to visitation. The regular visits went ahead but the woman's ex-husband was not meant to be there. He was, but again I couldn't prove it so it was allowed to slide. My ex, the woman and her ex-husband had a really weird relationship. I couldn't possibly imagine what they were doing while my son was around. The next hair strand test came back saying that my ex had greatly reduced his drinking to acceptable legal limits. I still wanted him to be completely sober because an alcoholic can't just stick to 16 units of alcohol a week. The next test came back saying that he was back to his previous levels of a bottle of whiskey a day. The social worker still kept trying to convince me to allow longer unsupervised contact, but I still refused to budge. It went ahead anyway. My ex stopped turning up or would bring my son home early regularly. I told the social worker, but now he was pushing for overnight stays. I again refused because an alcoholic and a child abuser and her ex-husband would be there. It was at this time I started seeing someone. He thought the world of me and my now 14-year-old son. A new law was passed, meaning the social worker had to do safety, criminal and social services checks on every adult involved in family court. My partner came back clear, no criminal record, not even a parking ticket, no social services problems. My ex's partner, the woman, on the other hand, came back as showing that her children had been removed by social services and adopted. As a consequence, my ex lost all visiting rights at the next hearing. He was allowed to write to my son 6 times a year. He did write, once. I went out and bought nice writing paper and envelopes for my son to write back. He didn't want it though, so that was the only letter my son got from him. He didn't bother with birthday cards or Christmas cards. He never had, even when my son was a 5-year-old and going to supervised contact, and he should have been trying to impress the supervisor with his parenting skills. I never had an apology from the social worker after what I had been saying for nearly 10 years turned out to be true. My son, despite having dyslexia and being on the autism spectrum, studied hard and did well in school tests. He went to college after that to study computing. He doesn't drink or smoke and has never been in trouble with the police. In fact, the police have told me he's a credit to me and we need more parents like me. Not bad for a single mother, huh? My ex died 4 years ago. The drinking caused him irreparable liver damage, diabetes and epilepsy. His now wife, still hasn't bothered to speak to my son. We went to his funeral, more for my ex's mother and sister than anything else. They're nice people. I hadn't kept in contact with them, but I don't hate them. His sister was the one that found me and rang me to tell me about my ex's death. My son has got back in touch with his other grandmother, aunt and cousins. We speak regularly now and meet up for coffee every now and again. My ex's wife got back together with her ex-husband. It felt good to get that entire story off my chest, even though it took nearly 10 years of fighting. I'm glad I never gave up on my son or his future. Sorry it's such a long post. There's quite a lot of the story, and if you've made it this far, thanks for reading it all.